Welcome to History 112, Lecture 8, Party Politics. The era from Grant to McKinley is often referred to as the Gilded Age, as a term that was come up with at the time and comes from a novel. And essentially what they're saying is this. Gilding is a process of gold plating an object, so they're saying that America is gold plated, that it's shiny and beautiful on the surface but rotten underneath. And the Gilded Age really is defined by corruption and greed that lurk below the polite, prosperous luster of American society in the late 1800s. And that image really strikes a chord with authors at the time, and they really run with it when they're talking about social critique. While we will eventually get to some of those critiques and some of the problems with this time period, we should first begin by understanding that this period is characterized by remarkable stability. The two political parties are fairly evenly divided, and loyalties fluctuate almost zero. In the five presidential elections from 1876 forward, the average popular vote margin separating the two candidates was about 1.5%. When it came to the states that really determined the electoral votes, 16 states solidly and consistently voted Republican, whereas 14 mostly southern states were solidly and consistently Democrat. There were only about 5 states in doubt, and those were determined in national elections. And again, in those national elections, the margin was under 2%. Now, Republicans at this time tend to appeal to business, and they often are also supported by nativists and are going to support immigration restrictions and be pro temperance. They're going to tend to control the Senate and the White House. The Democrats are going to try to appeal to the working man, especially to Catholics and immigrants, and they're going to try to control the House of Representatives. And in order to do this, both political parties are going to rely on machine politics. While at the national level, the two political parties do tend to gravitate towards distinct interests, at the local level, party identification has more to do with general cultural inclinations than with anything else. And you should understand that people cling to party loyalty with great passion. But at the national level, on the other hand, this is really all about political machines and controlling the patronage system. National leaders want to win elections so that they can control the system of rewards. And again, this is a time period that's defined by an understood system of votes in exchange for rewards. You vote for the candidate then does something for you. And that is something that also helps people be very, very involved in their parties. And we should understand because there was a direct correlation between your vote and some expected award, voter turnout in the 19th century is extremely high, pushing about 78%. Now, while there was a lot of rewards and patronage handed out, the federal government actually did very little. The big exceptions are subsidies to railroads and intervention in labor disputes and administering a system of pensions for Civil War veterans. Beyond that, and beyond handing out of patronage and those rewards, that's about all the national government did. Now, during this time that's marked by limited federal activity and high amounts of patronage, we should understand that the presidency is custodial. In other words, he took care of the country, he didn't take charge of it. He was really there to hand out the government patronage in the forms of jobs for party supporters. He kept the seat warm and the lights on, but he wasn't really the active decision making president that we're more familiar with from the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Now, the one exception is Hayes, and he tries to go through and reform the civil service system and make it more honest, but he doesn't get support from either political party, and ultimately Hayes doesn't seek re election and becomes a one term president. Now, the Republican Party at this point splits into two factions: the stalwarts, who are supporters of traditional machine politics and patronage, and the half-breeds, who are reformers. And the half-breeds favor civil service reform. They want merit-based appointments. At least that's what they say in public. But the reality is this is more an argument about who gets to control the handing out of patronage than an argument about how patronage is handed out. Now, this argument comes to a head in the election of 1880 because the Republicans are looking for a candidate. The main choices they have available are Grant, who is looking to run again, Blaine, the leader of the half-breeds, and then John Sherman, who happens to be William Tecumseh Sherman of Civil War fame's brother, and currently at this time the Secretary of the Treasury, and they all represent very different choices and interests for the Republican Party. And ultimately, they cannot agree on any one of them, so they come to what's known as the Dark Horse Compromise. And that, again, comes from a 19th century novel where a horse comes all the way from behind suddenly at the end and wins the race, comes out of nowhere. No one expected it. And that's, again, what they're trying to say about this election, is that these candidates are completely unexpected. And what they do in this compromise is they put James Garfield, a half-breed, in as a nominee for president, whereas Chester A. Arthur, a stalwart, is a nominee for vice president. So you're basically splitting it between the two factions as a compromise so they can get a unified position on the ticket. Garfield ultimately wins the election, and during that time he supports civil service reform. Now, what happens next is an unstable individual who is seeking a civil service position starts to increasingly believe that Garfield and his reform package is the reason he cannot get this job through the old patronage system, so he takes it upon himself to assassinate the president and starts making a lot of statements bragging about how he did it and how he wanted to do it and how it was a great thing, and people generally thought he was crazy. Now, Chester A. Arthur takes over and he decides that he's going to go ahead and push for civil service laws and major changes there. And the assassination really puts public pressure on the government to go ahead and make these reforms. And the Pendleton Act of 1883 is a result of that. And that creates the first National Civil Service Act where jobs are going to be filled by competitive exams rather than patronage. The idea being you're supposed to now get the most qualified candidate for the job, not someone who had been a supporter. So, in other words, the assassination puts pressure to clean up this particular aspect of American government. The election of 1884 is going to be one of the dirtier elections in American history. Now, Senator James Blaine of Maine wins the Republican nomination, whereas Grover Cleveland of New York is going to be a reform governor who's very popular with the Democrats and ultimately carries the election. Now, this election, one of its central features is that split within the Republican Party becomes magnified, and a group of liberal Republicans who nickname themselves mugwumps are going to leave the party and support what they call an honest Democrat. And so this split within the Republican Party creates Grover Cleveland's presidency, and he becomes the only Democratic president of the Gilded Age. During Cleveland's presidency, one of the things that's really fresh in everyone's mind is the impact of an assassination just years before that really changed who was in the White House from one faction of the Republican Party to another. So during this time period, they're going to go ahead and change the rules of secession. Now, what had been enforced in 1792 was after the vice president, it would fall to the Senate leadership. And what they're going to do is they're going to change that from the Senate that is controlled by Republicans to the cabinet offices in order of creation of departments. So in other words, it's going to stay within the Democratic Party. And that's going to be the system that lasts till 1947 when the Speaker of the House is declared to be the third in line. Now, Cleveland is also at this time going to reflect the popular view that the federal government should do very little. He is going to oppose protective tariffs, and he is going to believe that this is going to encourage Congress to be frugal and not to pass unnecessary legislation, and that this would also limit the federal government's size and scope. So in other words, if you didn't provide a lot of taxes, the Congress would have to scale back in order to stay within its means. So in other words, we're looking at a fiscally conservative Democrat trying to rein in the spending of what he would refer to as tax and spend Republicans. And his efforts to reduce tariffs are ultimately going to meet significant Republican opposition, and that's going to become a central issue in the election of 1888 because there is a very different idea about how the federal government should tax and spend. And at this point, the Democrats are the fiscally conservative ones, and the Republicans are the free spenders. Now, in the election of 1888 that follows, Cleveland is going to be defeated by Benjamin Harrison of Indiana, and it's going to be one of the closest elections in American history. And it's the first election since the Civil War in which the Democrats and Republicans differed significantly on an economic issue. While they tend to represent slightly different interests, here we really have Democrats arguing for fiscal responsibility and Republicans arguing for high taxes and high spending to run government programs. And it becomes a very close election, and it's one of only 3 elections in which the loser of the popular vote wins the electoral vote. You have Hayes in 1876 and then Bush in 2000. One of the more important pieces of legislation to come out of Harrison's presidency is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And again, the principal author is Senator John Sherman, SWT's brother, and the act he authors is largely symbolic. However, it's going to take on increased importance after the year 1900. Now, this act draws on Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. And what they are going to say is that they're going to forbid combinations in restraint of trade. That's any common economic bloc that somehow limits free market. Now, while the act was written to target trusts and to target monopolies, for in the beginning of the act, this was more often used to break unions than it was to break bad businesses. Now, monopoly is still going to be dominant until really about 1900 when it starts to change as people start to look at things a little bit differently. So for about first 10 years is just really a symbolic thing. In addition, Republicans during this presidency are going to bring in high protective tariffs to protect American business. That's something they're really interested in. And the McKinley tariff of 1890 is going to be the largest tax increase in history. And this is going to cause prices to increase. People are going to react negatively. Because unlike an income tax that takes a portion of the money you earn, a tariff puts a tax on all foreign goods, and that just raises the price, and that affects people across the board. And that's going to lead to big Republican losses in the mid year elections. And in 1892, we're going to see another election year coming up, and this is going to play very heavily there. Now, in the election of 1892, Harrison and Cleveland square off again with two things that are different. There's the big negative reaction to the McKinley tariff, so Cleveland's anti tariff position is going to be much more popular, and there's a third party running with James Weaver of the People's Party. Now, we'll be talking about that a bit in the next lecture, but what we need to understand here is that this is a group that is really representing disaffected farmers who had not really played a major role in the election of 1888. Now, all of that combines to mean that Cleveland wins a significant victory over Harrison, and the Democrats take control of not just the presidency, but also both houses of Congress for the first time since the Civil War. Now, the Wilson Gorman tariff that's going to follow is going to reduce tariffs 10%. It's going to be a tax cut, but it's not going to be as significant as Cleveland really was looking for. The Democrats controlled Congress, and they toned down what the president was asking for. Because tariffs are the main source of government income at this time, there is no income tax as such. So when he comes in trying to slash this, Congress decides that no, they're not going to dial it back to the extent that he wants. Politics in the Gilded Age really revolve around patronage, and the real differences between the two political parties begin to emerge later, and it begins to emerge over tariffs, over the government's primary form of income. The Democrats are going to be the fiscal conservatives at this point, where the Republicans are going to be for big government and big spending and for the big tariffs that are needed to pay for all of that. Now, that's going to start to redefine politics, but importantly, too, so are farmers, and they're going to emerge into a new movement that we're going to talk about shortly. See you in the next lecture.